Welcome to the Art of Procurement, the official podcast of the Catalyst Co community. And our purpose is to enhance the impact of procurement by elevating the discussion one conversation at a time. Here at Art of Procurement, Catalysts come together every single week to share their challenges, ideas, successes, and perspectives on the business of procurement. Hi everybody, welcome to this week's Art of Procurement. I'm the host, Philip Eidson, and after Take Action October, a month of small micropods that wrapped up last week, normal service is resumed today and we go back to the interviews. Now, before I go into the details of today's interview, I do want to remind you that the doors are now open to join the Catalyst Co platform. I talked about it a little bit at the end of each of the Take Action October podcasts, but this is going to be the final time in 2018 when you're actually able to join. The doors will close on November the 9th at midnight US Pacific time. So if this is something that sounds of interest to you, you're interested in looking into your own self-development or the development of your team in a new way, just check out the website. It's at artofprocurement.com/TCP. That's artofprocurement.com/TCP, and that will include a link at the bottom of the page to a video just to take a quick demo and to just learn a little bit more about our three versions. One is the professional version for individuals, we have a team version for smaller teams, and then we have an enterprise version, which is a real bespoke offering. So check those out. That's at artofprocurement.com/TCP. And today I'm joined by one of my good friends, Alison Smith. So Alison has a broad range of procurement experience. She's been a practitioner, service provider, trainer, facilitator, speaker, coach, you name it. Alison really has a broad range of experiences. I got to know her work under her moniker of the Purchasing Coach, so it's a long-running blog. It's something that I've really enjoyed reading, and her perspectives on how we can all unlock our own potential and then put that within the context of procurement. So her thoughts and approaches really challenge the status quo, which, as you all know, that's something that really calls to me. And so as I got to know Alison, I actually began to count on her for some of my own coaching needs, and I've been really excited to follow her progress as she began to write her first book, which is called Can't See the Wood for the Trees. So it was recently published just a month or so ago. The book helps readers unlock their potential, turn challenges into opportunities, and helps us to think differently. And so in today's conversation, we actually take a deep dive into the book and, of course, contextualize it for procurement. So as we go into the conversation, the first thing that I ask Alison, as I always ask my guests, is did she find procurement or did procurement find her?
Procurement definitely found me in terms of I went to my careers advisor at university. I'd been doing business studies and I said, I don't know what I want to do. And they said, what do you like? And I said, and in the end, they turned around and said, well, you like people and you're very analytical and therefore purchasing's for you.
Right.
And the rest, they say, is history.
Yeah. So what kind of roles did you start in purchasing?
Expediter in the days when we didn't have computers. So you were ringing up, you had a piece of paper with the orders on and you were ringing up companies, or you were sending faxes across to Hong Kong to find out when deliveries were going to come, because I work for Plessy, buying integrated circuits and printed circuit boards. Back
in the days when you had to use the telephone.
Yeah.
Not fear it.
Yeah, no computers.
Yeah. So how did you then move from, a career in purchasing and, doing, I think, more traditional purchasing work to a path where I know you kind of bring together both purchasing and personal development, but what was the kind of trigger, if you will, to move more onto the personal development side of the equation?
I think I went on a journey myself and started to uncover more about me. And as a result of that, went on a neuro-linguistic programming course, came back full of the joys and enthusiasm about it. And my then boss allowed me to use it. And at the time, we were merging. Bank of Scotland, Halifax were merging, so there was lots of need for communication, influencing, and all the things I was learning about. Yeah. There was a need for it. There was quite a bit of need for coaching. So I was allowed to do that. And then the role came about doing communication and personal development manager. But I think you're right. I think every now and again I think, I'm going to go off and become just a coach, and it's not going to just be purchasing. And I get too enthusiastic about purchasing.
You can't leave it behind.
I can't. Yeah. I get very passionate about purchasing being done well. And there's lots of the behavioural skills that make that possible. And because I suppose I've done it for over 30 years, I can hear the enthusiasm in my voice when I'm talking about purchasing.
You still got the passion for it. It's really what it's about, isn't it?
A passion for, yes, and doing it well.
Yeah. Have you seen, over the years that you've been doing this, there's been kind of a shift towards procurement professionals, procurement leaders opening up to the idea of, one, I think, coaching on its own, but two, it's kind of moving towards behavioral and the softer skills versus it just being very black and white and about numbers?
I've gone quiet. This is one of those situations where you think, what's the answer there? The answer is there's a lot of people saying it, but I'm not convinced that the KPIs and the measures and some of the languaging has changed around it. So it's still very us and them sometimes in organisations, and we're still measured on savings. And I think that makes it very difficult for somebody within a team to be saying, well, I'm being told I need to get better at talking to my stakeholders, but actually it's all about price. So I think there's a disconnect there. And I think some of that comes from our relationship with the rest of the business.
So it's kind of still aspirational. We want to think of ourselves as perhaps being beyond savings, but while we're still measuring ourselves on savings, not that much is really going to change.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well, what gets measured gets done.
Right. Yeah, and it's...
so long as... Sorry, carry on.
No, please go ahead, Alison.
Well, so long as somebody's been measured and their salary perhaps is conditional on meeting certain goals, then absolutely, why on earth would somebody be going and doing something that I consider to be the right thing and the right way of going about it, but actually then doesn't give them the gold stars and the pat on the back that I think they should be getting.
From a coaching perspective then, how would you coach somebody who has that situation where personally, professionally, from their pride perspective or where they want to develop, they want to be developing more around the value creation, more around bringing innovation in, more around building a lot stronger relationships with, and I say stakeholder, but I mean that really everybody that you interact with, while they're in an organization that's very heavily cost savings focused. What do you say to people who face that challenge?
Good question. Well, the interesting thing is, as a coach, I shouldn't be saying anything. So as a coach, I should be helping somebody identify, where are you? Where do you want to get to? How do you get there? And, what's stopping you getting there? In some organizations, even as a consultant, in some organizations, I am not the right fit for them. Yeah. And I think it is about the coach helping somebody identify their values, the values of the organisation they're working in, and whether or not they are able to work in that environment. And if they can, a lot of people would suggest that my values don't fit within business at all sometimes. Right. But I think I personally see it as a challenge. All I can do is go in there and be me and hope that inspires people to change. And I would be encouraging people that if they're prepared to stay in an environment and change from within, great. But if their values are being compromised, then I would never be the person saying, yes, you should stay in the job you're in.
Yeah, don't fight it.
Sort of.
Find an environment that's more suited or more in line with your values.
Sort of, but there's so many people that have left business, turned their back and said, I don't want anything to do with it, that we do need people within business fighting from within, I would say.
Yeah, as you think about your career, and the work that you've done so far, would you say that you've had an aha moment that is, either there's been an epiphany that's perhaps changed how you think about what you do and how you do it, or just something that's been really impactful on the rest of your career?
Had I known at the time it was an aha, it would have made life a lot easier.
Right.
My first ever boss, I was doing a project. It wasn't purchasing related. I was heading up this little team. I was, early 20s. I was presenting to the senior managers, 80 senior managers, and I did it the only way I know how. Sort of light-hearted, passionate, enthusiastic. And, managers were coming up to me afterwards, patting me on the back, breath of fresh air, thank you, Alison. And my then boss, or should I say my recollection of what my then boss said, because it may actually be inaccurate, was, don't you ever do that to me again. And it was because to him I had not conformed to the stereotype. I'd not done it the way that you should do it or ought to do it. And I think I've spent the rest of my career fighting that. And even recently, and I've done coaching on myself, etc. Even recently, a few years ago, during a workshop, and I'd been told, oh, this client needs it to be more, stereotypical, tone yourself down a bit. And I tried, and it just wasn't working. And it wasn't until I stood there and went, actually, these people know I'm not being me. Yeah. So it's like people will forgive me being excitable because they go, well, that's Alison.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, if I'm there being toned down a bit quieter, people go, she's hiding something from us. And then they don't know what it is. And then they react to that feeling of there's something not right. And as soon as I was me, then whether the client, stereotypically wanted that or not wasn't the point. The point was they started then interacting better with me. Things improved. Scores were better. Not the scores of the be all and end all, but it did mean that they were getting what was happening. Yeah. And I think that's my biggest aha, had I known about it, because that's been my challenge. Because yes, in my coaching, I invite people to bring their humanity to work, to be us, to not leave all of who we are at the door.
Yeah,
but that's because it has been a challenge for me.
Yeah, no, it's. We were talking off mic a little bit about, just my evolution through the podcast as well, feeling the same. You start by trying to be somebody that you're not, perhaps, or somebody you try and cover up for what you may consider to be weaknesses, as opposed to just embracing them. And at the end of the day, you're going to be more comfortable and more impactful if you're yourself, as opposed to trying to hide something and suppress something. And that's certainly something I didn't realize until pretty recently, to be honest with you, because I always tried to conform as well, in any of the offices that I was in, or, this is how you should look and this is how you should talk. And it fits a very cookie cutter kind of mold.
Well, and I think, on some of the workshops, people go, well, but I didn't realize I could do that. Mm-hmm. And they think that, well, purchasing has to be the bad cop. We have to act a particular way. This is how we do things. And so when, in training courses, we're talking about communication styles, flexing the styles, influencing, change management. Oh, what, you mean I can do that? Well, yeah, that's about being human. That's about the relationship you're building, whether it's with a supplier, stakeholder, or, within your own department.
Yeah. And everything we do, although it's in a business environment, it's people to people, isn't it? So it's about building those personal relationships with people. Yes, you got to be responsible, but if we become too mechanical, I think that's probably been one of our difficulties in the past. Is it looks like we're not human.
Completely. I mean, I've had suppliers turn around to me and say, "Oh, hang on a minute, where's Miss Nice Guy? My girl gone," because they've crossed the line. It's like they misunderstand the chattiness as we can get away with anything, and then they, oh no, there's a line. We cross the line. The tone comes out.
It's not all plain sailing.
No.
One of the things in your book, so I mentioned in the introduction, your book Can't See the Wood for the Trees, something that really resonated with me, and I think it is in the early stages of the book, was a quote that trying to control your life is like trying to control the weather. It's something that really resonated with me. I think that ties a little bit into the last comment as well. I just wonder if you could explain a little bit about kind of the context of that quote and what it is that you're really trying to articulate.
You're right, it is very early on in the book, because it's the example I give in the book about why metaphor is so helpful, because I'm a control freak. Mm-hmm. And, actually earlier you were talking about not wanting to be seen to be getting it wrong and the vulnerability aspect. And I think, my control, I think, comes from that. I understand my values. I've got a value of freedom. That means nobody tells me what to do. And so in the context of my life, then other people controlling me is something I push back against. Yeah. But actually somebody turning around to me and saying, rein it in, or telling me what to do, or even putting a mirror up and saying, this is what you're doing, isn't going to work very well. And, the whole reason I think that I use metaphors quite so much in the work I do, in a coaching perspective, is because metaphors work for me. Mm-hmm. Because actually you tell me that I'm being controlling and I can go, no, I'm not. Whereas, actually, yeah, I do. I try, and actually it was much easier in the context of thinking about trying to control the weather. If somebody disagrees with me, I feel, or have in the past, felt it's my control to get them to change their mind. Yeah. Whereas if I look at it from a perspective of the weather, well, that's ridiculous. Yeah. I can't change the weather. If I want to go swimming tomorrow, I have to check the forecast. I can't make it be sunny and nicely warm. I just have to understand the data and adapt to the data. And actually, if the forecast's going to be better the day after, then that's when I go for the swim, not tomorrow. And I think using that analogy meant that I could understand the futility of me trying to get really controlling, and although some people would say I still am, but
it's a journey. Everything is a journey.
Yes, I could hear people going, "What? You still are?" But there's an element of the futility of trying to change somebody's mind. I can't change them, just like I can't change the weather. Mm-hmm. I can adapt my style. I can understand and forecast the elements out there that I need to forecast, and it just takes the energy that's there in the control out of it a little bit.
Yeah. To me, it really stood out because, I feel like I'm trying to control so many things that are outside of my control, but you don't really see that. Maybe you don't see it because you're just in the moment and you're not really looking at things from a macro level. But how can I adapt and adjust to things that ultimately I'm not going to change in a fact, I think helps to release some of the burden on trying to change everything. At least for me, that's kind of how I took it, to not really be as, to try and be as involved in everything that I want to be involved in because I can't change them. So why am I using so much energy on worrying about them?
Nature is very flexible. Mm-hmm. It's the one thing when you look at, as I look out of my office window now, everything out there is flexible.
Yeah.
And perhaps that's why I use nature in a lot of the work I do, because there's a truth about how nature works that we can then tie into. Indigenous cultures have known that for forever. And I think we can tie into that and make sense of life, bypassing the logic and the barriers, because, we've learned ways of thinking and ways of operating. And sometimes this is how it ought to be, get in the way of, actually, there is a different way.
Well, I want to talk a little bit more about the book, but to frame that up, it's, as regular listeners will know, it's just something that I've only just started in my interviews. So I'm probably not as good at asking this question as I will get, hopefully, over time. But I'm really interested for you to share maybe like 3 action items that, well, not really the action items right now, but 3 things that we'd like listeners to take away, if we've been successful in the conversation, what they would take away from our discussion, and then I want to come back at the end and ask some specific action items around those.
Lovely. Words have power would be my first takeaway. An example would be, why do we describe maverick buyers? Because I think that's an unhelpful phrase. So words have power.
Yeah.
Be yourself and take you into the office. Don't leave a part of you at the door. And try a bit of unconventional every day.
Okay. I'm jotting these down, and hopefully I can read my writing when I come to ask the follow-up questions at the end. So just for the context, I wonder if you could share, I know we talked a little bit about some of the background, but really the premise of can't see the wood for the trees. Why does it exist?
It exists because I used metaphor in coaching and for myself. And in fact, it started because I had a problem that we still have in procurement, which is we have lots of stakeholders that don't understand what procurement do. And standing up in front of managers who don't have procurement as a big part of their job and telling them about the procurement process sort of put them to sleep, and they didn't get them any more engaged.
Yeah.
So I started using a metaphor, and I used gardening. And it was about the fact that these stakeholders may not know what to do with a supplier and just sort of assume that the supplier turns up and gets on with what the supplier is supposed to do, and we don't need to manage them.
Yeah.
But if you start to say, well, how many of you have got a garden or been to gardens? We need to understand what the garden's for. Is the garden for barbecues? Is it for playing football? Or are you going to have a nice, plants? And then it's about supplier selection. So it's plant selection in this, in a gardening context. But then it's all the things that you do afterwards that people take for granted in a garden. Of course, you're going to mow it or get somebody to do it for you. Or you're going to, what's it called? Weed, feed, prune, cut back, put stuff in the compost heap, or put plants certainly here in Scotland, put them in a greenhouse until June, and yet we don't think about doing any of that for suppliers. All the nurturing and all the things that you'd need to do to have a nice garden that meets your needs. And what that then enabled us to do is take what people knew about gardening and say all of that applies to suppliers. So now tell me about the suppliers you've got in your garden, and then they come up with, we've got a supplier that's big tree in the corner that the roots are undermining the building. And it just enabled us to have a conversation with them about, how would you manage that supplier? So at some point you have to go from metaphor to real life. But how do you then manage that supplier? If that's what they're like, do they need time in a greenhouse? What does that look like? From a procurement point of view, it enabled us to have a discussion about who is the gardener, where are the tools, who's got a key to the tool shed. And so for me, it's that started in the 90s. And it was working really well. I think now we must have had, 300-400 managers that have gone through that process. And as a result, their relationship improved. At the same time as that happening, I went off to do neuro-linguistic programming and suddenly realized the metaphor was bigger than that. The metaphor was not just gardening, but landscapes and nature more, holistically, and not just purchasing, but life in general. So it went from gardening as a metaphor for procurement to landscapes as a metaphor for life. And then, the rest they say is history, because I've been doing that for 20 years on and off with clients, senior managers, teams. Every team I've ever worked with has ended up doing a vision setting day in nature one way or another. So maybe this is too simplistic, but is it really to help, the power of the metaphor is to help take away the jargon, to make what we do understandable for people who don't necessarily understand what exactly it is, because they can apply it to something that they're used to and that they can conceptualize in their everyday lives. Yes. I mean, if you think about, the common phrase, a picture paints 1,000 words, then I would say a metaphor paints 1,000 pictures. So when you say a supplier needs weeding, You don't need to say a load more.
Right.
Because people get,
Yep.
oh, right, I need to do this, I need to do that. And suddenly they get a whole load of thousands of words in their head. Whereas if you say, oh, it needs a supplier needs managing, you have to follow it up with a lot more words and all of the things that we take for granted about what that means. As soon as you go, but it's the same as weeding a plant or pruning a plant or looking after a plant, then suddenly you're opening their minds up to a much bigger raft of manuals, I suppose. I sometimes talk about it. They've got a manual in their head, and the manual they've got more information about currently is gardening than they do purchasing or supply management. And actually what we say is, you know what, this manual with a few tweaks suddenly opens you up and enables you to do supply management better.
Yeah, it's like a trigger. So it triggers you to recontextualize it around something that you already know or can understand.
Yeah.
So then you talked a lot about nature being, a metaphor for a lot of the things that we're doing, and that you use that a lot in helping people understand and contextualize situation. How do you go from that essentially to, some of the approaches that you've written about in the book?
A lot of them have evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
But what I noticed, and to be fair, I've written a number of books that never got anywhere because it was so niche. It was like, wasn't going to be able to be relatable to people. Yeah. And what I started to notice was that people were using landscapes in the sayings they were using to describe being stuck. So quite often if we're stuck, we say, I'm stuck in a rut, or I can't see the wood for the trees, or I'm up the creek without a paddle, like a fish out of water. Mm-hmm. And what I realised was you're using a landscape in the words you're using to describe being stuck. Therefore, you can use that landscape to find a solution. And I started to do that with people, and oh, wow, it worked. And yeah, the book arose from that, really.
And so within the book, you mentioned some of those sayings. You have a number of sayings that you kind of unpack that help, help you to think differently about certain situations or certain approaches, or maybe a particular challenge that you have. I just wonder if you could share a couple with them. And one off, I'm not going to go into the saying because I want to leave that open for you to take the best one that you think fits with this situation. But something we're always trying to do on Procurement is challenge assumptions. And that's not to say that, you're challenging them just for the sake of challenging them, but how from a metaphor and a sayings perspective do you unpack the act of challenging an assumption?
The interesting thing as you ask that question is that what I do with clients is say which of these sayings best describes how you're feeling currently. Right. So sometimes you start with the saying that most meets their needs at the time. The example that came to mind, and I don't know if it directly relates to challenging assumptions, was a business leadership team, very set in their ways, and they appreciated I sent them out into nature, and their head office was in the middle of the countryside, so it enabled it quite easily to go outside, and they're walking down a lane and they're just having a conversation about nature. So I've told them, you need to stay with the metaphor, keep out of real life. And they're walking down this lane and they're going, oh, this lane eventually peters out. We know it does. There's a bit of grass coming up in the middle. We're going nowhere, and actually where we are going is a dead end. So we're sort of stuck in a rut. And then as they were having this, and this is where nature, I am in awe of the fact that this happens so often, that as they're walking down the lane, and these guys and girls were in suits, and they saw an opening in the hedge, and they went, oh, well, we shouldn't go down this rut, we need to go through that hedge. And so they went through it. So I think it was 5 or 6 of them sort of pushed their way through the hole in the hedge, and it came into this open expanse of field, and walked to the top of the hill, and then they could see the vista all around, and they went, well, this is better, we've got more choice about what we do next. Oh, and it felt as if they could breathe. Now, the assumptions they've had were very unconscious before. They didn't realise that they'd got themselves stuck in a rut of this is the way it's supposed to be. This is how it's going to be. We're heading towards this brick wall. But what nature did was enable them to see that, metaphorically at least, which meant that when they then came back into the boardroom, they were able to have a conversation about, so how do we get onto that field metaphorically? How do we move out of that rut onto that field so that everybody else around us wants to join us in this field? Because, everybody's going the opposite way because they know we're heading for a dead end.
How can we take kind of that experience, and that team was fortunate that they were in an environment which was conducive to at least doing that in person, if you will. How can we take that and simulate it in a more traditional office environment? Stimulate the thought processes that team went through to realize that maybe there is another way, and we should start thinking about different ways as opposed to just doing what we've always done.
On numerous workshops, I get people to, of recent years anyway, I've got people to draw. Mm-hmm. So somebody might draw a mountain and they might keep drawing the situation. I had one team where they drew a castle. They were in one castle and their stakeholders were in another castle, and they were doing what you do when you're in castles. They were sending over, what they called? Cannons.
Yeah.
They were firing on each other.
Bow and arrows.
Turrets.
Yep.
And so they drew that picture, and that was how they depicted their relationship with this other team. And when they considered, and they sort of then run the metaphor, if you will, and they go, well, if we come out of our castle, will they come out of their castle? Oh, no, they won't come out of the castle. If we invite them, no, they won't. And they ended up sort of a bit, they crossed the river. So the river to them meant something. I don't know what it did. It didn't need to mean anything to me. Mm-hmm. They crossed a river to the same side as the other people that they were wanting to improve their relationship with, and set up a barbecue and drew a barbecue and said, actually, this barbecue will draw the people out of their castle and then we can have a chat.
Yeah.
So for me, it was the drawing that enabled them. A lot of the time, metaphors and a lot of the sort of other unconventional tools I use, what I have noticed is it moves people from blaming the other person. So it's the other person is sending the cannonballs over or firing at us, to going, but this is what we can do to change the situation.
Mm-hmm. And realizing that your own choices have power.
Completely. I mean, there was one team where they did this wonderful drawing of finance, and finance had got a brick wall all the way around it and barbed wire around the brick wall.
Right.
But the beautiful, and then they had a conversation about what they needed to do to bring the brick wall down, or what was the end result. Oh, we wanted to be in a, not surrounded by this wall. But as the person was leaving, they turned around to me and said, I think we might have put finance behind the wall. Mm-hmm. Now, their original situation was finance have built the wall, finance are the ones that are keeping us away. But as a result of this process, they sort of took a bit more responsibility for, you know what? I think we're building some of those brick walls. Yeah. Some of this relationship, or the state of our relationship, is due to some of my behaviour, not just them.
Yeah, that's self-awareness. I've talked about that a lot on the show the last couple of weeks. So important, isn't it? That, we often come with these assumptions that it's always somebody else's issue, or perhaps that there's nothing we can do about it. It's out of our control. I know we talked about that a little bit earlier, figuring out what is in your control and what is not in your control, but being aware enough that perhaps sometimes it can be you, or there can be things that you can do to help a situation, starts to break down a lot of barriers.
There's normally more that you can do than you think. And I think that's where metaphor comes in, because metaphor enables you to not get caught up in if you and I are talking and say, well, how's the situation with X? And then I go off on one. Oh, well, you want to have heard him last week. He had another go. And suddenly you're into justifying why you're angry, justifying why you're right. And you get yourself into this little, I'm right and they're wrong. And actually that then stops you seeing what you can do differently to change the situation. Metaphor sort of enables you to put that, or, all of that content, as we call it, to one side. Doesn't matter what they said last week. This is a pattern, and the pattern can be busted, and we just need to find out how to bust it.
Yeah, it's you tell yourself a narrative, don't you? I know I do. And it's funny when you mentioned right at the beginning about what you took from an early boss and what he said to you, and how that's kind of what you've told yourself he said to you at this point.
Yeah.
It may still be 100% true, but it becomes your own personal narrative. And then your personal narrative controls so many of the decisions that you make, because you just hold that out as being fact, when maybe it's just a version of the truth that you wanted to hear, or that you told yourself over time because it made you feel better for some reason.
Definitely. There's three, I've written a blog, there's three versions of the truth, or yours, theirs, and the actual truth.
So as I start wrapping up, I want to return back to those three things that we talked about earlier that we wanted to, try and get out of the conversation, and some actions from the conversation around. The first one I just want to touch on is words have power. As you think about that, what do you recommend to, as you're coaching or in workshops, about the power of your words, and perhaps how to be a little bit more aware of what it is that you're saying?
I think it's really difficult to go straight to having awareness about yourself. And I find it really easy to notice in workshops what other people are saying. So I think it might be about observing other people in your team that you work with to go, oh, that's an interesting word. I wonder how that informs how they're behaving, their tonality. And then you can then start to say, oh, I use that word too.
Yeah.
So there is a notice the language you're using, particularly in a situation that you're not happy about. I've not got a great relationship with this person. Okay, so observe the language. So actually, procurement's language about our stakeholders is quite unhelpful sometimes.
Yeah.
Maverick.
Yeah.
If you look up in a dictionary what maverick means, it's no wonder we've not got a great relationship if we're labeling our stakeholder as that, because that language then informs how we behave, our beliefs about those individuals, and we get into this vicious circle that we have manufactured by the very words we're using. If procurement could take us and them out of their language,
right,
they could increase their relationship or improve their relationship with stakeholders.
Yeah. One word that drives me mad, that we use all the time, and I may be on a losing battle with this, but every time I see somebody use it, I'm always kind of pulling them up on it, is the word vendor. How can we expect to build relationships with organizations when we call them a vendor?
Gorgeous.
It drives me crazy, because you're just signaling to them that, hey, you're here as a transaction, nothing more than that. You throw away, I can replace you whenever I want, because you're nothing more than choosing who I'm going to go and buy, a hot dog from at the fair. It
Gorgeous.
Drives me mad. And I've been on a crusade for 10 years to try and stop people using that word, and I don't think I've got very far. But just the signaling alone, I think, is really important when you're thinking about using words like that.
Completely. And I don't think that we ever have to give up.
Yeah. So that was my little rant. On anybody who's still using the word vendor, please think about using, even if it's supplier, just think about the signaling that you're sending to the other people on the end of the email, or the end of your vendor management program, or whatever it may be where you're using that term.
Well, it's like supplier relationship management. It's relationship management because there's two parties to this relationship. I'm going, oh, hello, supplier. We want to relationship manage you, but it's not two-way.
Yeah.
That's what the language is saying.
Yeah, we'll do it as long as it's in our benefit.
Yeah.
The next thing that I jotted down was be yourself. And I know we talked about that a little bit earlier. How do you coach people to do that responsibly? So, not going all out, and getting yourself fired the next day, but to at least, take down some of those walls that you may have created around yourself because you think you have to act or look or do in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is doing it slowly. And I think there is an element of being aware of why is it that you're not prepared to be yourself. Mm-hmm. The action I've written down is identify one person, and perhaps with your question at the back of the mind, one person who perhaps it's safe to do this with or safer to do it with. Identify one person and identify what's the one thing that you haven't, or you are leaving at the door, that you're not telling them, that you aren't able to be, and try and be that with them.
Interesting. Yeah.
And just notice.
And doing it within a safe space. You're creating a safe space to do it within.
But the other thing is to notice how other people are able to do it, because sometimes we get ourselves into our own little bubble.
Yeah.
And we don't realise that, oh, well, actually, that person over there is doing it. And quite often the people we admire are the people who are doing the things that we would like to do. It's like, well, actually, that person can do that in that environment. What is it? And yes, perhaps you do need a coach, or perhaps a coach would be helpful to explore, because sometimes we might go from one extreme to the other because we haven't actually understood that it's our vulnerability that we need to work on. Yeah. And that's why we're not able to ask for help, for instance. Rather than try and pretend to be, I can cope with this, I can cope with this, I can cope with this, how would it be if you just said to somebody, I'm not sure about this, could I have a chat? That's not, I don't see, some people would see that as career limiting, and yet my control bit means that sometimes I want to be able to, get the answer myself.
That's interesting, because it's kind of, it's showing vulnerability, isn't it?
It's hard. It's really hard. I mean, I can always remember ringing up one of the guys that I work well with, but I know I tried to solve it, but I'd got myself into a right little mess. Yeah. And I just rang up and said, I'm really struggling with this. And we solved it in about 5 minutes. And I went, you know what? And just because he was able to ask better questions, because I'd got myself into a bit of a knot. And just because of that question and that conversation, I thought, oh, for heaven's sake, why do I not do that more? Why did I not ring him a week before rather than have...
Right. No,
what?
I do the same, and you'd keep it inside of you. You'd never want to show a vulnerability. You'd want to show that you knew everything, even if it's plainly obviously that you don't, but you don't want to show that there may be any gaps in, or that you have perhaps made a mistake, or you're not sure what to do. That was always mine, is if I wasn't sure what to do, I never really wanted to show that, at least earlier in my career. And, as I then grew into other roles, I would tell my teams, like, don't be a hero. We're all kind of here together. We're in this together. Collectively, we can have far more impact than any one of us on our own, and we're all here to kind of help each other. But when I was earlier in my career, I never saw that, because I saw it almost like I was either good or I was bad, and there was no in between. And if I didn't know what to do, that meant I was bad at my job.
And perhaps that's the action then. Perhaps the action's more about very specifically saying, go and ask for somebody, if you don't normally ask for help, and you do try and be the, I can do this, then go, set yourself an objective in the next week to ask somebody, or to admit that I don't know. Mm-hmm. Could you talk me through this? I don't actually understand what that acronym means.
And then the last one I want to touch on, and I know that I say I want to touch on, we could probably do an entire episode on this. And that's, and I just say that, we'll give some links at the end, but I know you've written extensively and talked extensively about being unconventional. How do you boil that down into a couple of action items?
Well, actually, that's a really easy one, I think, because the action is do something different every day. Yeah. That's the action. And do it every day for 21, 28 days. Don't just do it something different for 3 days, because you'll do the easy things. I did this exercise a couple of years ago, and you're right, I wrote a blog at the time. And, I set this as objectives for people. I'm, supposed to be open to new things. And about day 15, realized how often I was saying no to things. Oh, I can't do that. No, I don't like that. Don't like coffee. Oh, no. And so it was I mean, I know that sounds silly because it says I then said yes to coffee, and I found out, oh, actually, I don't like the bitter taste of coffee, but I quite like coffee when it's got sugar in it. Yeah. And now it's opened up the fact that sometimes when somebody's only got coffee, rather than me going, oh, no, I'll stick with water, I found myself able to say, yes, I'll have a coffee. And that's opened up things that I could have never imagined they would open up. And so I think there's something about if you do something every day, then you will start to do things that you may previously have seen as unconventional. Mm-hmm. Yes, I use unconventional tools in my coaching, and that's my point of difference. So I might get people drawing. We might go for a walk. But I don't think it's about doing that. I think it's whatever each of us individually would find as, yeah, I always go this particular route to work, or I always do this. Find the things that you always do a particular way. I always go to this coffee machine rather than that coffee machine. I always say no. I mean, for me, the 28 days was about how often I said no to things. Yep. Oh, I don't like that. Well, I didn't like it 20 years ago. Have I subsequently tested that out? Oh, no. Things have changed. Yeah. 20 years later, I've got a different palate. I've got a different mindset, etc., etc.
How in the in your day-to-day work in procurement, where do you look for the inspiration to set yourself these challenges of doing something different? How do you figure out what it is that you do that's the same all the time that lends itself to doing something a different way tomorrow?
Oh, great question. You see, unfortunately, it's built in. One of the trainers I work with thinks it's funny because he said, well, you don't ever do it the same way each time you do the training. And it's because I'd get bored. So there is an element that I find it fairly easy in that context. And I think it's just, perhaps it's having a conversation with somebody else to say, is there something that I do a particular way? Or I don't know whether it is noticing it, if I'm honest. I think what I found is by doing something different every day, and you'd start with things like brushing your teeth the opposite way, going a different journey, putting your socks on before your shirt, or, it's little things that are of no consequence really, but you realize their consequential because when you do them a different way, you go, oh, there's a jarness, and you recognize then how it feels to be in a pattern. And I think once you've got that recognition radar on that says, how many things am I doing sort of by automatic pilot, that once you've got it into your, as they say, conscious, into your conscious awareness, then suddenly your brain opens and goes, oh my God, why do I always do that? But I think it's just start with little things that don't even feel like much until you try.
Inconsequential, or they feel
sort of. Yeah, they absolutely feel it, but at the time, tried brushing your teeth with the other hand, and that you soon learn why you brush your teeth with the other one.
Right, or maybe you find out that you're ambidextrous and you never knew it.
Well, and I think that's what happened with. We can put a link to the blog because what I did was write what I did every day and my own personal reflection on it. So the other thing it does is go back to journaling. That I went to a friend's book launch last week about journaling, and there is something about we can become more self-aware just by journaling, by spending time reflecting on our own thoughts and our own actions to raise from our unconscious awareness into our conscious awareness about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what might be informing why we do something a particular way or react in a particular way in order for us to resolve it and let it go. Yeah.
Well, Alison, I want to thank you for joining me on the show today. I know it's about time to wrap up. So I just have a last question, and that's where can listeners actually find out a little bit more? Where can they find the book, and where can they reach out if they'd like to contact you directly?
I think the easiest thing is do a search, Alison Smith, the purchasing coach, and you'll find my purchasing coach blog, and it's got all the links to YouTube, Instagram, Amazon for the Can't See the Wood for the Trees book, etc., and or Alison Smith, Landscaping Your Life. So I've got two websites, one particularly aimed at the Landscaping Your Life and the book, and then obviously the purchasing coach one, which is where the blogs I think that we'll be linking to were likely to be found.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I will link up to those and the blog posts that we mentioned in the show notes today.
Perfect.
Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/Alison Smith. That's artofprocurement.com/Alison Smith. So, Alison, one last time, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.